Okay, well, I think it's settled down. So welcome everyone to this lunchtime event with General Tim Cross. It's brilliant to have you here with us today. My name is Chris. I'm part of the team at Five Talents. If we've not met before, thank you for coming along to be part of this. Just a little explanation before I introduce Tim. About 6 months ago, shortly after Russia invaded Ukraine, we had an event where we discussed the conflict, and Tim gave us some incredible insights and perspectives on the conflict. And we were sat as a team about a month ago saying, wouldn't it be interesting to get an update from Tim? And he very kindly agreed to provide that today. So Tim, thank you so much for your willingness to come and talk to the Five Talents family today about this continued conflict. For people that haven't met Tim before and don't know Tim, let me just introduce him. Tim spent almost 40 years in the British Army, including serving in Germany and Northern Ireland, Cyprus, the Gulf War, and in the Balkans. He rose through the ranks to become a major general, leading a division, which is apparently 30,000 troops, which is absolutely incredible. And since retiring from the army, Tim's roles have included advising the House of Commons Defence Select Committee, lecturing at 3 universities, and holding seats on the boards of several private companies and humanitarian and Christian organisations. Tim is also a lay reader in the Church of England, and he is a wonderful friend to Five Talents, including a member of the Five Talents International Council. Tim, thanks so much for coming today.
You're very welcome. Good to see you all again.
Brilliant. A couple of simple things from me before I hand over to Tim. The first is to say that Tim is going to give us an update on what's been happening in Ukraine, and then we're going to be asking him some questions. If you would like to ask a question, please find the chat function on Zoom and drop your question into there, and we will ask as many questions as we can today. Perhaps also worth saying, explaining why in Five Talents are we focusing on this conflict in Ukraine, when so much of our work at Five Talents is focused on East and Central Africa. Well, I think many of us in the UK can recognise the impact that the conflict in Ukraine has had in a practical sense on our lives through the rise in the cost of gas, through inflation, the impact on pretty much everything that we buy. We felt the pinch. And that pinch is felt even more for our members in East and Central Africa, where people are living on far lower incomes. And we know anecdotally that in Uganda, for example, the cost of fuel has almost doubled over the first 6 months of this year. We know in Kenya that the cost of maize has almost doubled over the first 6 months. But as we were preparing for this, we came across a quote from the Brookings Institution. I just wanted to read you this quote to help sort of frame the impact that the conflict in Ukraine is having on members, Five Talents program members in East Africa. Here's the quote. It says, the Brookings Institution says, the deterioration in the global economic landscape has exacerbated suffering in the world's poorest countries. Still recovering from the sharp downturn caused by the pandemic, low-income countries are being hit hard by soaring inflation at home and rising global interest rates. Dislocations in global commodity markets due to the pandemic, amplified by the war in Ukraine, have led to food and fuel shortages and to surging prices of staple consumer goods. This is eroding real incomes, exacerbating food insecurity, and worsening extreme poverty in lower income countries. Surging world food prices, which reached their highest levels on record this year, are contributing to the rapid rise in low income country inflation. So it just helps to set the context there for our conversation today. And we're certainly seeing, as I've explained, the reality of fuel shortages and the hikes in prices of things that our members need to buy every single day. Final thing I wanted to say before I hand over to Tim is simply this. I know that today we'll talk a lot about the military implications and the military concepts within the war in Ukraine. And we've already talked a bit about the economic impact, but I just wanted to focus us and reflect on perhaps the worst part of it, in fact, the very worst part of it, and that's the human element of this war, on the loss of life, on the misery, the destruction of homes and communities. And I just wanted to say, before we launch in and talk more about the military elements and the economic elements, our thoughts and prayers, I'm sure for all of us, our thoughts and prayers continue to go out to everybody in Ukraine, and indeed all those that have experienced loss as a result of this terrible, terrible war. So on that note, Tim, I'm going to hand over to you and ask you, if you will, to give us an update on what's been happening since we last spoke.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris. And yeah, thank you for that last comment in particular. I had a Ukrainian with me actually about 10 days ago who was going back over to Ukraine, and we were praying about, various aspects. Actually, interestingly, he was looking at, how they hope to rebuild. So there's hope that, this thing, and indeed it will come to an end at some point, clearly. So since we last spoke, well, of course, the news every day really is moving us forward pretty fast. There's been lots of things in the media over the last few weeks, which I'm sure everybody's been reading. I'll give you a sort of couple of points that I sent out as an update to some of the people I work with, some of the companies I work with and so on, just in the last few days, and in particular, touch on this threat of nuclear, which we'll come back to, I'm sure, in question times. So Putin, of course, has made the announcements that he made about taking the referendum or doing the referendum in the 4 provinces. The results of that, I think, are coming out today, actually, and it inevitably will show that, according to Russia anyway, everybody thinks Russia's wonderful and they want to become part of it. And some of the percentages they've been quoting, around 97% of people in favor, are clearly ludicrous. But nonetheless, it is a really important time because those provinces, as far as Putin and Russia are concerned, will become part of Russian territory, and therefore weapons, fighting, further incursions by Ukraine, even the use of NATO-provided ammunition is part of this whole issue about Putin saying he will respond, and he's not bluffing about what he will do if people attack Russian territory, which is what those provinces will become. He's even talking about bringing some of the Ukrainian people in those Russian territories, provinces, recruiting them into the military or conscripting them into the military. He's recently fired a couple of people that are not unimportant. The most senior general in charge of logistics for the whole campaign has just been fired, and the deputy defense minister, a 4-star general, has also just been removed for a whole litany of failings, but mostly seen as a punishment for the flaws in the logistic support of this campaign. Putin is increasingly taking a hands-on role in directing strategy, reporting or phoning frontline commanders himself, overriding advice from the ground. I mean, it's not, one's got to be careful about, over-exaggerating some of this, but I have to say it's difficult not to do that, or it's difficult to exaggerate because it is pretty serious. But it looks increasingly as though it's rather like Hitler in the bunker towards the end of World War II. And he's sacking people over the place and not listening to advice. He's replaced the defense minister, the deputy defense minister, by another general who's a 60-year-old, actually, who's under British sanctions over his role in the siege of Mariupol. And he will be faced with this whole logistic challenge of equipping, training, organizing, and then deploying the reservists that Putin has announced are being called up. The figure of 300,000 is often quoted. In theory, he could call up 1 million, but that figure of 300,000 is the one that's being used at the moment. They're under pressure militarily. Putin has refused to allow commanders to take action, as in withdrawal, to minimize losses. And there is danger of them being surrounded in various places, again, rather like Hitler. So there are serious morale problems, cohesion problems, command and control problems. There's desertion problems. The wounded are being forced back into the fight. And apparently Putin has signed a hastily approved bill that threatens or toughens the punishment of soldiers who disobey orders or desert or surrender. And over the last period of time, Putin, or we've also seen several, I think about 7 or 8 top generals being fired and another 10 being killed. So from a military command, senior command point of view, there's some serious stuff going on. Now, as far as the nuclear issue is concerned, as I say, he's announced that if the territorial integrity of Russia is threatened, which would include those 4 provinces, then they will use means, all the means at their disposal to protect Russia. And then, of course, he declared that this wasn't a bluff. Now, the reaction of the West has been to say, well, if he's saying it's not a bluff, it really is a bluff. There's all sorts of people talking about this issue. My own view is, and I've just been saying this to Chris and Rachel, that megaphone diplomacy at this time does not help. Politicians, senior people shouting at each other through the media. And we need to get back to the old way of thinking during the Cold War years. I served in Germany during the Cold War 4 times, into thinking through strategic deterrence, including nuclear deterrence. And we might want to come back to that in the question time. Russia has an arsenal of tactical nuclear weapons with a range of around 300 miles, with yields between sort of 2 and 10 kiloton. The atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima had a yield of around 15 kilotons. So, these are serious weapons. And the other thing that hasn't been mentioned much is that they do have stocks of chemical weapons, which are part of weapons of mass destruction. They've used them elsewhere in places like Syria. So would he use these weapons? Would he use weapons of mass destruction? Well, he's clearly irrational. If he's pushed back into a corner, I reckon he just might. And there are various things he could do. There's this, you may have heard of this island called the Snake Island, which is unoccupied. They pulled out of it recently. And he could hit that island with a tactical nuclear weapon or indeed chemical weapons, just to show a demonstration of power and to sow fear in Ukraine and the West. To do that, he has to use the chain of command. He doesn't just press the button himself. So there's the whole issue of the Russian senior general staff, the military command. Would they obey an order to launch these weapons or not? I might come back to that again. And I do think as part of this issue, there is inevitably and rightly a very serious discussion going on in the capitals of Western Europe and elsewhere. Are people really prepared to exchange nuclear weapons over 4 provinces of Ukraine? And you know, I'm one that says we shouldn't give in to Putin. We need to continue to support Ukraine in all sorts of ways, which again we may come back to. But you know, it is a serious question that people will be asking themselves. And this Nord Stream pipeline that's just been blown up, probably right by Russia, again sending messages about energy supply and so on. I think Putin's big card that he's trying to play throughout all of this is to sow division amongst the Western European nations, Poland, Hungary, Germany, France, Italy, and the whole business of the increased energy prices as we obviously come to the winter season. And that winter season includes restrictions of further operations in Ukraine because of the weather, snow and bad weather and so forth, which it will inevitably curtail some of the current offensive operations that are going on. And again, we can come back to that. So, Chris, I think that's probably enough from me at the beginning. I hope that sort of, skates out an overview, and let's pick up some of the questions that people have been passing in.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Very helpful to hear your perspective on that. And again, we're grappling here in this conversation with some quite frightening concepts, aren't we? But it is helpful to get your perspective. I guess the first question that we wanted to ask was, we see Russia has worked hard to try and take territory in Ukraine. Ukraine is now pushing back. We hear some positive headlines about the Ukrainian effort to take back ground. We hear some headlines suggesting that's very hard in certain parts. Doesn't feel like Russia is about to give up anytime soon, as you've mentioned. What do you see as the most likely themes and outcomes of the next 6 months or so?
Yeah, well, going back to our last session, my own perspective, and actually as a result of listening to MOD briefings and various other lines of communication that I've got, was that Ukraine's strategic or operational level campaign plan was to hold ground, to get more people into the military and to get more weapons from the West, and then to launch some sort of major counteroffensive, probably next spring. Now, what happened was, for whatever reason, they decided to start some counteroffensive in this last month or so, and they played that quite well. They looked as though they were going to put the counteroffensive in one part of the provinces, and indeed they did some work down there. But they then launched a major counteroffensive in the north around Kharkiv and 1 or 2 other places, and that caught the Russians by surprise. There's no doubt about that, and it made a lot of progress. And they are now very close to the Russian border. Never mind about the territorial borders within Ukraine. But that counteroffensive, effectively, I mean, one's got to be careful about all of this, but effectively it has run out of steam. The Russians have managed to hold. This decision to conscript another 300,000, that is not going to be easy. The first are arriving in the camps in Russia and are being moved to Ukraine. Now, if we were talking about British conscripts, we would be talking about bringing them into proper training facilities and taking quite a long time to train them properly, to equip them properly, and to form them into formed units and so on. That's not the way it's going to happen in Russia. They will feed these people in relatively quickly with limited training, limited equipment, and they will feed them into units that have taken heavy casualties over the last month or so. I mean, there's some reports of some of these Russian tank armies and infantry groups suffering 40, 60% casualties. We need to be very careful about these statistics. Inevitably, Ukraine will be exaggerating them one way, and Russia will be, exaggerating them, inverted commas, the other way. But nonetheless, it's clear that they have taken serious casualties. Now, if we go back to the way the Russians think about this, and we saw this without going too far back in history, but the defense of Moscow, the defense of Stalingrad, and Leningrad and one or two other places in World War II, the Russians are prepared to sacrifice an awful lot of people and feed young soldiers into the battle, as I say, badly trained and under-equipped. And I hate to use the word cannon fodder, but in simple terms, that's what they're trying to do in order to stem this advance by the Ukrainians. And in there, what they will be thinking is, if we can hold this, what we've got, hold the current ground, the winter is coming, as I said earlier, which means the conditions will change, and it makes defensive operations far more difficult, the mud and the rain and the snow, et cetera, and the cold weather. So they'll be trying to hold the ground they've got. The Ukrainians have got a difficult time now, because if Russia goes ahead, and clearly, as I said, I think they will go ahead with declaring the territories, the provinces, part of Russian territory, the Ukrainians have to think about this. Do they continue the offensive operation to try to secure the rest of those provinces, which won't be easy, as I say, and to be honest, I don't think they'll be successful in that this side of Christmas. Or do they just hold the ground they've got? Russia will be probably going to be putting an offensive elsewhere, I think in the south in particular. Inevitably, there will be people talking about we need negotiations, and they'll be doing that in the context of what I talked about earlier, which is, do we really want to risk the exchange of weapons of mass destruction over these provinces? So I think there'll be increasing pressure on Ukraine to get around the table and talk, but President Zelensky and others have made it very clear they are not about to sit around the table and negotiate. So do they carry on with their counterattacks? Do they hold ground whilst they get, and I think they will get, more support from the West, both militarily, but also economic sanctions and politically and so on. And the last thing to say on that before we move on is that although the West is providing and has provided a lot of equipment, the bottom line is, here in the UK, for example, we are running out of stuff. After the Cold War, we reduced our material stocks of ammunition and other material substantially. I mean, we closed 2 out of our 3 major ammunition depots. We've got one left near a place called Kyneton, not far from Leicester and Birmingham. But, you know, a lot of the stocks that we've been giving came out of war maintenance reserves for ourselves. And so we've got to get defense companies making more. And the contracts for those, in most cases, haven't been let yet. The government are in discussions with people like BAE Systems, but BAE Systems don't have the production lines set up ready. They'll have to establish them. That means a lot of money, and they want guarantees from the government that the government are going to pay for it. And in the current economic climate, of course, that's not easy. So, although Zelensky is calling for more weapons from the West itself has some problems here and will want to keep reserves in case this thing escalates and expands into the Baltic states or elsewhere. It's a bit of a long answer, but I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense, Tim. Very helpful. I just want to pick up on a few themes, if I may. So let's just pick up on that last one around the fact that the West is, quote unquote, running out of weapons. Presumably, that's a problem on both sides. You know, you hear some references to that in the media, but for people like me who know nothing about this kind of thing, I don't know whether they have warehouses full of bombs or whether actually it is these things have flowed in just in time. You know, what is the likely impact of that shortage on both sides? So I think it was thinking the news about North Korea potentially providing some weapons to Russia. How do you see that particular issue impacting the conflict? Yeah,
there's no doubt that Russia is using a lot of particularly munitions, particularly artillery ammunition. I mean, the Russian doctrine, if you go back again to look at things like the Battle for Berlin and so forth, they use incredible amount of firepower, kinetic energy from artillery, from rockets, usually from the air. I mean, the air dimension is one of those interesting aspects of this campaign that Russia doesn't seem to have achieved anywhere near air supremacy, never mind about air superiority. So, you know, they are using a lot of kinetic attacks, and they are pushing back against some of the ground that the Ukrainians have taken. So they will be using a lot of stock. Now, where is that? They had a large stock compared to the UK. The Americans have got, you know, a large stock too, but even the Americans are struggling in some of the particular weapon systems we're talking about. The Russians are using older equipments now. They have got some very modern, very capable armored vehicles, but they have relatively few of them. So they're going back to using T-72s, T-64s, and they're using our old artillery systems and old artillery ammunition. They are getting some resupply, I think, from other countries. But interestingly, those other countries are beginning to close ranks. China and India. India, as you know, they had this meeting recently with China and India. Both China and India have publicly said that they don't, they want negotiation. They don't want this war. And if, and therefore, will they be prepared to continue to supply Russia with material and ammunition and so on? Ukraine, the other thing we don't hear much about is Ukraine has taken serious casualties. I mean, this is a desperate war for them. They have lost more infantry killed and casualties in this campaign than the whole of the British infantry, British Army's infantry. That was a fact about 3 or 4 weeks ago. They've taken a lot of losses in their own equipments. They've taken a lot of losses in their command structure, particularly amongst their NCOs and senior NCOs and young officers who always bear the brunt of fighting in these sort of conditions. So, Ukraine again has lost a lot of people and a lot of stuff. So, as I said earlier, with the West trying to help them resupply them, I think that will take time, and again will take the edge out of this offensive, I think. But I think overall, if you take a broader strategic picture, the capability of the West as a whole, particularly the UK and US, supported by others, but to a lesser degree, Germany and France and so on, that industrial capability, I think, is greater. Well, I know is greater than the Russian capability. The question is, how much do they have in reserve, and how much are they prepared to throw into this, and how much are they prepared to wear down their own stocks? So overall, over time, the West undoubtedly will be able to out supply the equipments, the material, which is what, right, at the end of the day, war is all about logistics. I mean, it is a human event, and as you say, it's individual people who suffer, but the people who will win through this, if it's a long drawn out campaign, will be those who can produce the best logistic and material supply.
Okay, Tim, thanks for that. That's interesting to hear. Question that somebody asked was, we're obviously, the UK and other Western nations are obviously providing the materials for the war, but also are there other forms of support that they're providing? Can you talk to us a bit about the sort of planning support and other elements of support that they're providing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it ranges from at one end of the spectrum. We are training young Ukrainian conscripts in the UK. They're training in British Army training areas in the up in around Catterick and areas, South and Salisbury Plain and so on. Relatively low-level tactics, weapon handling, weapon skills, weapon drills, how to survive on a battlefield and so on. And we're training around 10,000 of those through till next month. We've probably trained, I would think, about 6,000 or 7,000 already. So we're training young soldiers to enable them to go, back into battle and fight better. We also are trying to help train the command and control structures of this, the NCOs I spoke about, but also particularly the senior level commanders, people who are commanding battalions and brigades, who, as you move from defensive operations to offensive operations, require a better understanding of how you conduct that stuff. And very crucially in that is A, the logistics we've spoken about, but B, the intelligence, the battlefield intelligence. And we are absolutely providing intelligence on a regular basis. So are the Americans to the Ukraine. And I've got no doubt at all that that intelligence and that understanding of that operational level of campaign planning and so forth was a key part of preparing the Ukrainians for the offensive that they've conducted over the last few weeks. Now, again, we need to put that offensive into some sort of context. It's relatively small. I mean, for the people fighting on the ground, it's tough. And people often talk about low intensity operations. Well, I can tell you, when they're shooting at you, it isn't low intensity, it's pretty high intensity. So I don't want to diminish what's happening there. But if you look at it in the context of the whole of the Ukrainian Eastern Front, in inverted commas, it's relatively limited. So preparing the senior officers for conducting broader counteroffensive operations and giving the equipment to do that, and crucially, the intelligence to do that. And alongside that intelligence, we're also, to conduct those operations, we are also providing intelligence on where the Russian equipment is, from air-mounted platforms flying up the border, the western border of Ukraine, and indeed elsewhere, places like Poland, Romania, and so on, and passing information to the Ukrainians on where Russia is, massing its forces, preparing it, and so on. And all of that is very crucial. Conducting war is about understanding where the enemy is, understanding how best to, and where best to hit them, and having the ability to sustain those operations over a period of time. So the West is providing a lot of support across the piece, really.
Thanks, Tim. Just picking up on the observation you made there about some of the insights in terms of conducting war, I'm just follow-on question there would be simply, what have we learned? What has the West learned about the Russian war machine through this conflict? And what have we learned about our own, if I can tag that on there? It seems that it's been quite revelatory in some senses, but has there been genuine useful learning through this?
Yes, there has. I mean, I think, one of the things we have to be honest about is that we can be accused of overestimating Russian capabilities. I mean, I referred to the Cold War earlier. That obviously went on for decades, and I served in northern Germany, as I said, four tours, total of 9 years over there. And on the other side of the inner German border, we tend to forget that in those days there was a divided Germany, east and west, and a divided Berlin. There was an organization called Three Shock Army, which was a Warsaw Pact army level, military capability, military power. And our assessment of their capabilities was always pretty high. We felt that they were very capable organization. And that was, partly as a result of the operations in the East during World War II, the way they used their combat power, particularly, as I say, their deep strike capability, their artillery systems, their air, and so on. And I don't think we were wrong to do that. You must always, take these things, you look at the various options that are open, but nonetheless, we were right to think that this was a serious capability. But I think what we've seen in Ukraine is, I think it certainly surprised me. I think it surprised a lot of people, their lack of an ability to really conduct strong offensive operations. Now, there was reasons for that. And I think last time we touched on this, but I've got no doubt at all that in the early months of this campaign, a limited campaign as far as Russia was concerned, genuine belief that Ukraine is part of Russia, part of the Rus, that the spiritual homeland of Russian Orthodoxy is in Kiev. They wanted to secure Ukraine, but did not want to do a lot of damage. They surrounded Kiev, they put in limited operations in the east on the basis that they thought Ukraine would give in pretty quickly, the political leadership would leave, and they would secure Ukraine, without major combat operations. That clearly went wrong, and they've had to use much more combat power. They didn't have a lot of that combat power in place ready. They've had to gather it from around the country. They've had to reinforce, and we know with this mobilization, etc. So they've constantly underestimated how this campaign should be conducted. And that's the biggest criticism against Putin, but also against his senior generals. But from our point of view, we undoubtedly feel that they have not performed as well as we would have thought. And that's one reason why I personally don't think that they're going to start trying to open up another front in the Baltic states or anywhere else on NATO's border, because they just haven't got the capability, of achieving that. Now, alongside that is what have we learned from it? And there was a review conducted last year of what's called the Integrated Defense and Security and Development Review, a command paper. And from that, various decisions were made, including, to put it most simply, the recognition that there were certain sunrise technologies, cyber, data, space, and so on, AI, that were the new incoming technologies that we needed to utilize and develop and put lots of resources into. And that the sunset technologies of heavy armor, heavy metal, large numbers of infantry, what we would call mass on a battlefield, those were things that were drifting away. They were not as important anymore in the view of the people who conducted that review. Interestingly, the Prime Minister has just asked the man who was involved in that review, a guy called John Pugh, to re-look at it in the context of what's been happening in Ukraine. And the Defense Secretary, Ben Wallace, who I think is very good, but nonetheless, Ben is convinced that mass is unimportant, relatively unimportant in today's world. What's more important is this whole data, AI, cyber, drones, and all of that stuff, in what we call intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, ISR. And he's not wrong in that. But I think what we've learned is that if you do end up in a battle in the way that it's been going on in Ukraine, you lose a lot of people and a lot of stuff very quickly. As I said earlier, they lost the equivalent of the whole of the British infantry. Now, Are we going to find ourselves engaging in those sorts of battles in Europe? Most people would say, no, we're not expecting Russia to invade England, and we're not expecting to put a brigade or a division into the fighting in Ukraine. But under NATO, we are accountable for delivering our power, our combat power, particularly for an Article 5. And that's what might emerge from some sort of exchange of chemical or nuclear weapons and so on. So we've learned that the Russians are maybe not as powerful as we thought they were, but nonetheless, let's not underestimate what they are now getting up to. But on the same side, we've learned that whilst these new technologies are key and crucial and we need to invest in them, some of the old business, heavy metal, tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, particularly deep strike artillery, are still very important capabilities, indeed air power as well.
Really, really helpful to understand that, Tim. I'm just going to jump in, Tim, and ask a quick question about the British Army, if I can, before we get back to talking about Putin. You mentioned there about sort of the balance between new technologies and traditional methods, if I can call it that in my non-technical speak. How ready is the British Army for conflict? We hear such conflicting things again in the press, and I know that we have to be careful about what we believe, but the idea of aircraft carriers without aircraft on them and various things like that. Can you just give us a quick thought on where we're at as a nation in terms of our own armed forces?
Yeah, well, it's a big issue in and of itself. Since the end of the Cold War, we have reduced the size and shape of the British military substantially. And there's an argument, and I agree with this argument. There's a critical mass which, if you fall below, you no longer become a major player in this area of involvement. The Navy, I think, fell below that. The new aircraft carriers undoubtedly have given them a substantial greater capability. The new submarine fleets that are coming in, and various other equipments. Now, yes, they've got the aircraft carriers. They haven't got full complements of the aircraft to go on them. They've got helicopters. But they haven't got the full complement of of the new aircraft, which is called the F-35, which we're buying and actually are very much involved in manufacturing alongside the Americans. The government have just ordered a few more of those, but they will take time to arrive. The Royal Air Force in the meantime, is flying basically with a new Typhoon fleet. Tranche 3 we're now into, very capable aircraft. The trouble with aircraft, and they're waiting for F-35s as well, the trouble is they're blooming expensive. They're $70 million a throw, and they take time to arrive from production lines because they're highly capable, very technical systems. The army has been reduced in size considerably. People talk about an army of 82,500. The reality is less. It's about 76, 77,000. And when you look at an army of that size, you've always got to remember that a large chunk of it is involved in training and headquarters and all sorts of other stuff. It's not readily available to deploy anywhere. Now, when we deployed to the first Gulf War, we deployed an army, an armored division, which I was part of, excuse me, of about 35,000. The serious question today is, could we deploy an armored division of that size today? And if we were able to deploy it, could we sustain it? And my honest answer is, I don't think we can. Now, the good news, in inverted commas, is that the government have said, and Liz Truss, as part of her leadership campaign, said she's going to increase defense spending to 3% of GDP by 2030. Now, she might be out of power in a couple of years' time, but nonetheless, when you look at the figures, that in pounds, shillings, and pence, to coin a phrase, that doubles the defense spending, puts it up by about 52 billion. We don't know what the size of the GDP will be in 2030, but current defense spending is about 48 billion. This would add another 52 billion, doubling it. Where would that go? Well, it would certainly go into probably more of, as I said earlier, the IT, the AI, the drones, and the reconnaissance capabilities and so forth. The question is whether it would also go to increase the size of the army and give it more equipment capabilities and so on. And my instinct is that they will increase it. In the rest, there are lots of people in the Ministry of Defence, including, I have to say, mostly civil servants, but who are arguing that we just do not need a big army. But going back to our earlier conversation, I think what people are now beginning to scratch their heads and say is, well, okay, but we've reduced down from well over 100,000 only a few years ago, down to less than 80,000. That's probably gone too far. and we need to just think about increasing the size and shape of it. So, more money is coming, in inverted commas. Whether the government will be in power to deliver that, and whether a next government will continue the movement on that, only time will tell. But a lot of it will go into equipment, and a lot of that equipment is very expensive stuff.
Right. Thanks, Tim. Interesting there. I just am mindful that time is ticking, and I just want to swing back to talk about President Putin. It's obviously Russia's war, but it's very much Putin's war, from what we understand. Can you talk to us about the murmurings again in the press that we hear about his health, about discontent within his inner circle from both sides, those that would be more hawkish, those that would be sort of more reserved? Where do you think it's at with Putin? What do you think is going on? And what is likely to happen, do you think, over the next few months?
Yeah, obviously it's a key question. I think there's a lot of wishful thinking going on. I think in terms of his health and so forth, there are indications sometimes the way he walks or talks or whatever. But again, can't be careful of comparisons. But Hitler was jolly ill for a long time towards the end of the Second World War, and they tried to blow him up on a couple of occasions. But he limped through it all, in inverted commas. I don't think, from a health point of view, Putin is about to disappear off the scene. So I may be wrong. There may be some serious problem, but that's not my sense. When we come back to his position in power, a very good friend of mine, a professor called Roger Gill, is doing some work on autocratic leadership. Why do we have so many autocratic leaders in the world, not just in Russia, but in places like Turkey and China and all over the place? And that's it's an interesting piece of work. But I said to him, well, I think somebody needs to do some work on why do people follow these autocratic leaders? Why do they put up with these ridiculous things that they get up to, whether it's Mao or Pol Pot or Stalin or Hitler or whomever, Milosevic, Saddam Hussein, etc. And the reality is that people do put up with them. And whilst in Russia there is undoubtedly discontent, I don't think there's any doubt about that. And this mobilization order has led to, as we've seen, lots of people trying to cross the border into different countries because they want to avoid the draft. That's understandable. And mothers and so forth, dead bodies coming back, etc. There will be a lot of discontent. But in my own view, the chance of Putin being overthrown by, in inverted commas, a liberal majority, I just think is, again, wishful thinking. And the question would be, if he went, who would take over from him? And on my other side of the coin, there are a lot of key players who are much further over to the right-hand side of the spectrum, hardened people, including some generals, whose criticism of Putin is actually what I was referring to earlier, that he should have gone into this at the beginning very strong, very hard, and very quickly, using every weapon system at their disposal to achieve a quick campaign. The equivalent, if you like, of shock and awe that we did in the first Gulf War, and to a degree in 2003 as well. Putin's decision not to do that, probably on advice of all sorts of people. Nonetheless, these guys, these hard generals and others, think that that's what should happen. And if Putin was to go, I think the chances are he would be replaced by somebody on that side of the spectrum. We're not going to see a Western liberal Democrat emerging as the new leader of Russia in the short to medium term. I mean, we can all pray that should happen. And in the long term, maybe it will happen. But Russia is, again, one of these countries that seems to be comfortable with strong autocracy and dictatorship and so on. And although there are people complaining, it's rather like Iran, the rioting that's going on in Iran as a result of the shootings there. One would love to think that regime will be overthrown. But I just don't think that's going to happen in the near term. So I think what's going to be happening, again, pulling together one or two comments, Russia's not been doing well. Putin's been backed into a corner. He's not going anywhere soon. If we've got to be very careful about thinking through how we deal with this. As I said earlier, the strategic deterrence, the thinking during the Cold War, of what we called MAD, mutually assured destruction. Putin needs to be convinced that if he starts this, then there will be mutually assured destruction of Russia as well as anywhere else. And that whole deterrence theory that was understood by politicians and generals and academics in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, most of that understanding has gone away. It's been replaced by, as I say, shouting, megaphone diplomacy, and an awful lot of wishful thinking. which, I don't take any joy in saying that, and I may be wrong, but that's that's as I see it.
Thanks, Tim. That's again just interesting to hear your reflections on this. I've got two questions I just want to ask you before I hand over to Rachel for a final thought. We've only got a few minutes left, but I just wanted to ask, if Russia was to use a tactical nuclear device, as it has consistently threatened to do so, how would other governments respond?
Yeah, and that is the key question. I come back to my earlier point of that time. I think America, Joe Biden has quite rightly said that he is not prepared to say, on the media what his response would be, because again, that's part of deterrence. Deterrence is built around uncertainty, leaving people not quite sure what the reaction will be. I don't think there's any doubt that Putin and some of his harder people, I think they genuinely believe that the West would not respond with nuclear weapons. And depending on whether they use nuclear or chemical, whether they use somewhere like Snake Island or somewhere else to lay on a demonstration, in order to bring disruption in Ukraine and to bring disarray within NATO as to how best to respond, I can't honestly see Germany or Italy or Poland or Ukraine, Hungary in particular, agreeing under a NATO umbrella to a nuclear response, because they're the guys on the front line. They're the guys who would end up with the radiation coming over their borders and all of that sort of stuff. So I think the response would be a much greater support to Ukraine conventionally, sanctions-wise, diplomacy, and so on. I think China and India, as I said earlier, would probably turn against Russia. Worst case, I don't think we're into strategic nuclear exchange here, personally. Worst case, there is a launch of a tactical nuclear weapon to demonstrate what's called escalate in order to de-escalate. In other words, Putin uses it on the basis that he would cause this disarray and disruption, and it will force Ukraine to the negotiating table. A, because they're worried about more use of nuclear weapons on their own soil, and B, because the Western unity, if you like, sort of falls apart a bit. One of the lessons out of all of this, of course, worth adding, is that Ukraine gave up all of its nuclear weapons as a result of the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, under guarantees from East and West that clearly, Russia is taking advantage of that. If Ukraine had nuclear weapons, would Russia be threatening the use of them? My own view is that, we'd love to get rid of nuclear weapons, and I certainly don't want to see proliferation of them. But I think an awful lot of people are saying, maybe this means that some other states are going to get themselves nuclear weapons, because when you end up with this sort of situation, if you haven't got anything to respond with on that scale, then you're in a difficult position. So I don't think the West is going to respond with nuclear exchange. I think it will respond in different ways, and let's just pray and hope that actually, of course, this moment doesn't arrive. But absolutely, see where we go from here.
Yeah, absolutely, Tim. I mean, it feels from what you're saying like we've still got some way to run on this terrible conflict, and obviously, you mentioned there about praying that we don't see nuclear escalation, which is obviously something I think we should all be praying about. Final couple of thoughts in a nutshell, Tim. What can we be praying for? Those of us that are people who pray, how can we be praying for this conflict from your perspective?
Yeah, it's an important question, and got to be careful what one says here. But we obviously at every Sunday on church, people are praying for Ukraine, and I'm not saying that just Lord, would you please sort out Ukraine is not a valid prayer in inverted commas. But the reality is, we live in a broken world, a very brutal world, and this is a very brutal campaign. So I would say to most people, where's your heart in all of this? I work with a charity that does work in Moldova called Love Moldova. And Moldova have got more refugees pro rata than Poland, or indeed certainly the UK and many other countries. In fact, I think all the countries. So Moldova are really suffering in terms of trying to look after these people. And we've got the family on the ground and others who are helping out, with food and so forth. So, I have a very clear link to that. I'm the patron of that charity. That's what I pray for. That's who I'm trying to support in different ways. And also praying for the young soldiers who are doing the hard fighting. Excuse my French, but the poor bloody infantry, the PBI, which are always the case. These are young 17 or 18-year-old, 20-year-olds, scared. Many of them Russian, haven't got a clue what they're doing there, dying and being wounded in large numbers. Not all Russian soldiers are bad people, in inverted commas. I mean, we're all sinners, and wars always take us into places that we wouldn't want to go. And there's no such thing as a morally pure, just war. I mean, that's just the reality of it. So young soldiers. I also work with an organization called Military Mission International, and we have contacts in Ukraine, in Russia, most of those states around that area. And we're having Zoom conference calls, and people are gathering from each of those nations, praying together for each other. But then there are other issues too. We should be praying for Putin. We need the Holy Spirit. One of the fascinating things here, we haven't got time to talk about it, is but Patriarch Kirill, Archbishop Kirill, the Russian Orthodox Church, has clearly convinced Putin this is a just war. He is supporting him in spades over this, and has even talked about supporting him if he were to go nuclear. And he's saying, passing messages to young Russian soldiers that if you die on the battlefield, you have a place reserved in heaven. It's like the Muslim faith. And it's, we need to pray against that. We need to pray that the patriarch will begin to realize that he cannot go on supporting this. It's not what he thought it was going to turn out to be. So there's individuals like the leadership over there, and of course our own leaders, who are trying to work through all the things we've talked about. How are they going to respond? And we need them to be influenced by Christians, frankly, amongst other faiths, but Christians in particular, about how to respond. And we need to pray that they will be supported, and that we will not. Again, we talked about the media. The media, whatever decisions are made, the media will pull it all apart. So we need to pray for, courage and conviction and good thinking and good outcomes. It's pretty general, I know, but I hope that helps.
Very helpful, Tim. Thank you so much for all you've shared today. So much food for thought and food for prayer there. We really, really appreciate you taking time to share with us and help us understand better. I feel that one thing we can all do besides pray, if we are people who pray, is inform ourselves and educate ourselves. And I was reminded when you were talking about autocratic leadership of a conversation I had with one of our partners in Kenya recently, who was sharing with me about how important it is for young people to join our savings groups, to learn how to read and write and count, and take part in the democratic processes of the savings groups. And she said to me, one reason this is really important is that we have to make sure the next generation of young people is equipped to elect good leaders. I was reminded of that when you were talking, so that's another point for prayer. As we close, I can't close without thanking you enormously. I also just want to bring us once more back to the human cost of this that Chris started with and that you echoed. I know we all feel very deeply the human cost for many families in Ukraine and indeed in Russia. There are costs in the UK, economic costs. I know people here are really struggling as well, and the threat of nuclear war is clearly terrifying for all of us. But I just want to bring us back very finally to the costs that some of the voices we don't hear from are experiencing. I'm thinking of the women who belong to our savings groups across Eastern Africa. They are now seeing the profits on their businesses squeezed. They're having to pay far more to get to market using fuel. Their savings are being eroded by the high cost of inflation, the shortages of food, exacerbated by climate change as well as conflict. So I just want us all to remember again those voices that we don't hear from in our media, and to, as we pray and as we think about the future, to remember those men and women too. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm sorry we've run a few minutes over. Massive thank you to Tim, as ever, for all your insights and for joining us. We're so very grateful and privileged to have heard from you. And thank you also to Chris for hosting. Bye, everybody.